Hi, Mario the Spirit Scholar, and I want to talk to you about fermentation. Now, you might understand fermentation based on foods like kimchi or pickles, but fermentation actually is a huge process in distillation because you can't have whiskey without really having a beer base. You can't have brandies or cognac without having a wine base. And those processes are what fermentation really matters. It's what's creating alcohol, because even though distillation does have a higher concentration of alcohol, that's all it's doing is concentrating alcohol. Fermentation is when alcohol makes itself present. So let's talk about fermentation today. So what is happening in fermentation? Well, for fermentation to happen, you need yeast present. And what do yeast need? Well, they need a nitrogen and oxygen-rich environment, and they need lots of sugar. And there's also a range of temperatures that they work in as well. So when all these elements are together, they can actually take all the sugar that's present and convert it to alcohol. They're not very good at converting other things. And they need things like starches broken down with enzymes to get at the monosaccharides, to get at the simple sugars to ferment them into alcohol. And we didn't even know about the existence of yeast until Louis Pasteur came around, and he showed the world that we didn't have spontaneous fermentation, which was a huge belief for millennium. He actually said the yeast was around on a microscopic level and converting that sugar to alcohol. And so thanks to him, modern beer, wine, whiskey, cognac, rum, everything, gin, vodka, it doesn't make a difference. We owe it to him because he cracked the code. We had suspicions about what was going on in fermentation, but he helped us realize these are the elements we need to make them work. And so thanks to him, we have a better understanding of fermentation. So the yeast itself needs a nitrogen environment. It has to be slightly acidic, it can't be base, and there has to be sugars present. It needs something to eat, at least to start off. And some of the wasteful things that come out of it are CO2 and heat, but we end up with ethanol, which is just basically alcohol at the end of the day. And so the more sugar and the more time that's present and the perfect environments, like it being warm for the yeast, is going to give you a better yield on your product. And so the yeast is going to work, it's creating these things. But there are some things that are beneficial and hurtful to future distilling. Sometimes sulfur is present because sulfur is something that is important for these grains, especially, to develop in soil. And so that's something why you have copper in stills, but we'll get to that another time. You're also going to see methanol, which is slightly different from ethanol, and that's more of the rubbing alcohol intense kind of headache product. And so when you're using a column still or pot still, a distiller makes a decision about how much they're going to keep out or incorporate into their final product. And you're also going to see some fatty acids, and the fatty acids are actually going to interact with the alcohols that are present to create esters. And now esters or congeners are things that kind of influence the flavor and the taste of your final spirit. So the yeast has multiple roles. And also yeast can even eat other dead yeast cells. They can eat alcohol as well. So they play a really big role and produce all these different varieties in your final spirit. And it's up to you as a distiller where you're going to keep and where you can get rid of. And there's some styles who embrace it, like Caribbean rums that really want really funky kind of things. Or sometimes you want something clean and straightforward, like a Scotch whiskey or a bourbon, and you want the base product to stand on its own and not the funkiness that comes through on the yeast. So these are decisions that are made in choosing the type of yeast that you want, because a lot of yeast are made in labs nowadays, or at the end with your distillation process or your aging process. So these are all factors really you have to keep in mind, because your yeast is a powerhouse. It's doing a lot of work for you, and at the end of the day, it's converting sugar to alcohol, but you have to be aware about what else is out there. But does yeast last forever? Unfortunately, it does not. You either run out of sugar, your temperature is not in your warm range and you end up getting cold or just way too hot. You have too much alcohol, so you end up overwhelming or killing the yeast that are present. So if the yeast have nothing to eat, it's a hostile environment, they're just gonna give you a stuck fermentation, or they're just gonna be done with your fermentation anyway. You really only see maybe 15, if you're lucky, 20% as your maximum alcohol produced during fermentation with yeast in any capacity. You also have bacteria that can eventually take over once the yeast gets weak. So it can only last for so long. So these are things that, keeping in mind of the life cycle of the yeast, that are eventually going to happen to you. And these things can be beneficial, like malolactic acid, and create complex flavors in the spirit that you like a Scotch whiskey. Or they can end up getting really funky on you and things you don't want at the end of the day, and they're going to give you a hard time during your distillation or your aging process. So even though yeast are good little workers and they can work as hard and as long as you can provide a proper environment for them, it unfortunately won't last forever. And producers need to figure out, when they buy their yeast from a distributor, if they decide to do that instead of a natural fermentation, they have to decide if I want a yeast that's going to give me a higher yield, a yeast that's going to give me more flavors. Do I want just natural fermentation and have yeast from the environment affect my spirit? So there's a lot of different directions you can go into. So it's not as simple as saying I'm taking my sugar and converting it to alcohol. You really have to take in the factor of what role that yeast plays, because it can be as big of a factor as your aging, as what type of still you're using, or your base ingredient. So it's really a beautiful process. It's naturally occurring, but there are decisions you have to make at the end of the day, and they're not always going to be easy. So if you have any questions about yeast, please comment below. Reach out to me at thespiritscholar@gmail.com, or just go to the www.thespiritscholar.com, and you can find my information there as well. But hopefully your questions about yeast are answered. Just simply put, it is a living organism. It absorbs sugar, it creates alcohol, and can have a major influence at your end product. So when you're at home and enjoying a super funky rum, you can most likely thank bacteria and yeast for that, for the most part. But as always, drink what you love and love what you drink.